it's such a nice opportunity for us, and we're so grateful to have you guys in here. And I've already passed around the green sheet for the attendance, so make sure if you're attending this event, please fill in. We kind of need it for the club. And also we have another event in 2 weeks' time. It's actually gonna be a kind of like a worldwide tour by a guy named Chris Johnson. He's this like photographer and filmmaker, and he actually has this project of spreading people on what being an atheist really means. And essentially his mission is essentially just to dispel this kind of grim kind of connotation that goes along with the name atheism, secularism, and all of that. So we do actually have it on tour. You could check the Facebook event for more details on those events. And yeah, it's in 2 weeks. It's before these kind of like the mid-semester break thing, and yeah, it's gonna be awesome. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks, guys.
Yes, I'm sort of the same. Yeah, his essay is excellent. It has nothing to do with the topic. His essay is a reflection on. Oh, yes, it's it needs to change the beauty of positive. So, that's how I remember it. It has nothing to do with it. It's just an essay you probably don't like. Oh, it's just that you don't trust your
Yes, triggers is not right.
Well, not right.
Worried about the right.
Yeah, double mistakes. There's like 2 good essays. Greg Restall. Yeah, it's about almost yeah. But it doesn't make good games. Yeah, it's
It's a rough walk.
yeah, more of the learn from. It's true. Like, it's not terribly. You guys it was fine. Great. I think it's sharp. People will come
and it's on
your wife is a politician, that's what you
So yeah, I might actually just leave you guys. So essentially, like, it's like there's still a detention. So when you pass them, I'll try to make it back here once it's finished, assuming that this event goes for longer than an hour. If that is no problem, but if I don't go back, then yeah, please just like grab my pen and then so maybe just like give it to it's please get the cookies. It's very nice. Yeah.
I think they used to be Okay, that's 6 p.m. on the dot. You just made it.
We're going to keep this open? Keep it open for a few minutes. I'll close it in about 5 minutes. Welcome everybody, thank you all for coming. It's a small, yes? Yes, by all means, take it.
Just because if they stay.
By all means, a small but sweet turnout, and I thank you all so much for coming. It does actually mean a lot. The reason why we put on these events is not to host some sort of blood feud between different camps and different ideologies. Usually what happens when people come along to these events is that they realize that there are a few big points, yes, I'm not going to lie, that separate people on either camp, but there is also a ton of similarity. And I think what we're really interested in is probing and unpacking what we mean when we say half the things that you hear in the media or whatever. Welcome, come in. What you hear in the media, what you hear from, say, a Christian or an atheist or a Muslim or a Buddhist friend, and to hear us cash out these beliefs is actually really, really helpful to promote interfaith discussion. So this is not a bloodbath. This will ideally be a reasoned debate and hopefully a very enjoyable one. But before we kick off, I'd like to quickly ask everybody, just to hear from the audience, why you came. Because it's always really interesting for the secular society to hear what motivates people to, there's a million and one things that you could do on a Thursday night, but you guys came here. So anyone have a, yes?
Well, I've known Leon and James for a long time, and I thought that this would be a bit different to most of the other debates you hear between Christians and atheists, because I thought they would both provide a nuanced discussion.
That's great, yeah. Anybody else? You don't have to have an answer, that's all right. I'll just continue my spiel in that case.
Everyone else is a family member.
I guess if you guys leave with a stone in your shoe after an event like this, then we've actually done our job. If there's something that's sort of niggling at you when you go to walk out the door and you go, oh, there's something I didn't know or I had thought about but I've forgotten, and it prompts you to continue thinking and discussing with people, then that's all really well. That's excellent. Actually, Matthew Julius posted an amazing quote. Who was it by? It was about if you only know your side of the argument, you don't know that very well.
Yes, Karl Barth.
Karl Barth, an excellent quote. And it's something that we do try to embody at these sort of events. Well, anyway, that's my blurb all over. I'm Stephen Spratley. I'm a computer science research student at the University of Melbourne. I was also on the committee for the Secular Society for about 3 years or so. And I'll be moderating tonight. I'll be providing dings or knocks on the table if these guys go over time, or I will give the 5 minutes knock on the table for you both, gentlemen, if there's only 5 minutes left. And also, if you want to text in a question, because there'll be 15 minutes of moderated discussion, there's the number up there. That's not my phone number, that's James's phone number. So you can also keep that for future reference, just if you're feeling hungry. Yes, all right, so that's the format. We have 20 minutes main points by each of our debaters, and then there'll be a 10-minute rebuttal from either one, and then we'll go into our 15-minute moderated discussion, taking questions from you guys.
15 minutes, not 15.
15. Oh, 15.
50.
There's a 50-minute moderated discussion after all of that.
Well, we can finish earlier if it'll get bored.
No, of course not. But that being said, I've just got a couple of bios, just so you know who's talking to you tonight. And you will no doubt have seen this on the Facebook page. Our first speaker, James Fodor, is a graduate student in physics at the University of Melbourne. He's a research assistant in structural biology at Monash University. He has a keen interest in philosophy and critical thought. He writes for the Rationalist magazine on various subjects in religion and epistemology, and I will highly recommend you go to their website, the Rationalist. And he's also the former and also longest serving president of the University of Melbourne Secular Society, engaging in numerous discussions and public debates. And for the Christian camp tonight, we have Leon Di Stefano, who is a research assistant in bioinformatics at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute, a parishioner at St. James Old Cathedral, West Melbourne, and keenly interested in philosophy and theology. So with that being said, I'm going to invite, and you can all invite along with me, James to the front podium to give you 20 minutes main points for, actually I should mention, is nature all there is just a contention. It's not an essay topic. This is not something that we're going to answer and solve tonight. This is something just to get the ball rolling. So generally you'll hear from either point, either something from a theist perspective or from a naturalist perspective. That being said, please join in welcoming James to the front podium to give his 20 minutes remarks.
Okay, so let me grab my notes here.
Thanks a lot for coming, everyone, this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see you all. So tonight I'm going to be presenting a naturalistic worldview, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Leon will be presenting a non-naturalistic worldview, and we'll see what where the discussion leads. So, key ideas that I'm going to be presenting tonight, the key components of the worldview that I'm presenting, the way of looking at the world, the way of understanding who we are and where we stand. There are three key principles that I'll discuss. These are naturalism, nominalism, and reductionism. I'll explain what each of those means. Once I've explained these principles and how they relate to each other, I then want to apply them to a particular case study or an example of a phenomenon, part of the world that we might want to understand better, particularly morality. Talking about how morality fits into, or can fit into a naturalistic framework. And finally, once I've presented the framework and given an application, then I'll outline some arguments in favour of a reductive naturalistic worldview, or reasons in virtue of which I think that this view is reasonable to hold. Now, before I start, I do want to emphasise that I'm not arguing that nature is all there is. I'm not exactly arguing that. Rather, what I'm going to be saying is that we don't have any good reasons to think that there's anything beyond nature. And in fact, we have good reasons to think that there isn't anything beyond nature. But I'm going to be focusing my attention on philosophical, sort of scientific arguments on this point. Now, some of you here may well hold the view that some things beyond nature exist as a result of other sorts of arguments, maybe experiential, theological, other types of reasons. I'm not really adjudicating those tonight. I'm just going to be talking about whether we have good philosophical, scientific type reasons to think that anything exists beyond the natural world. Okay, so that being said, let's start with the first of the three principles that I outlined, and that's naturalism. So what do we mean by naturalism? Now, giving a precise definition of naturalism, or the natural world, turns out to be difficult, and so I won't attempt to do it. Rather, I'll attempt to give you a sense of what I mean by that by starting by talking about non-natural entities. So these are things that are outside the natural world, or are hypothesized to be outside the natural world. They include things like magical forces and metaphysical concepts, immaterial souls and spirits, deities, a god, things like that. These sorts of things are thought to exist, if they do exist, outside of the order of nature, outside of the natural order of things, beyond the sort of regular causal chain of events by which things are supposed to, by which things regularly behave and are understood in science. That's the idea of a non-natural entity. It's something sort of different and other, sort of transcendent. What about a natural entity? Well, natural entity is just basically everything else. So people, planes, plants, particles, planets, even organizations like Pixar, they're all part of the natural world. The important thing to see here is that I'm including man-made things in this category. So the relevant distinction is not between the man-made world, artificial world, and the natural world, but it's between the natural entities and non-natural entities. That's the relevant distinction that I'm talking about here. So understanding, with that background, we can picture the set of things that might exist, or that are hypothesized to exist, as the big oval here, with natural things and non-natural things being their distinctive spheres. Naturalism is the position that the set of all of the things that exists in the world, the universe, however you want to phrase that, is the same as the set of things that is part of nature. Or in other words, reality is exhausted by nature. There's nothing beyond nature that is part of the world. That's the fundamental idea of what naturalism is. So, that's the first principle, naturalism. The second one I'm going to talk about now is nominalism. And I just want to briefly mention this, and I might talk a bit more about it later on in the evening. The basic idea of nominalism is that it tries to answer the question about what makes, or as it says here, what makes F things F, where F is just any property, or predicate is the technical term, but an example makes it easier to understand. What is it about a square that makes that a square? Or what is it about a cat that makes it a cat, like part of a larger category or class of things? What do they have in common that makes them part of the larger whole? Now, for a realist about universals says that something is a square, for example, if it instantiates some universal called squareness. And the idea here, sort of loosely depicted in this image, is that there are particular real things that in their sort of imperfect way, in some way instantiate the larger class or abstract entity that they represent. And that's the difference between the concrete thing and the universal. So that's what the realist about universals thinks. The nominalist thinks that there are no such things as universals, there are just particulars. So the particular form of nominalism that I'm going to be sort of defending tonight is called concept nominalism. This means that we understand universals so for example, in the case of a square, that's easy to understand. Something is a square if it fits our concept of what a square is. Now, that might not seem very enlightening, But I'll talk a bit more about this when I get to the macro states, which is something what I'm going to talk about next, so stay tuned for that. The basic idea, though, is that the normalist position that I'm outlining resolves these sorts of problems of universals by directing the dispute towards how do we understand our concepts and how we apply those concepts to the world. So that'll make a bit more sense a bit later. So that's the second point about nominalism, that is no universals. The third point then, and the most important one, is reductionism. So now I'll talk about what this means. Reductionism is the idea that everything that exists is sort of in one or two categories. It's either a fundamental particle or field or something like that, or it exists in virtue of particular arrangements or interactions or combinations of these particles and fields. Now, when I talk about particles and fields, I'm sort of gesturing at the sorts of things that are studied by fundamental physics, so electrons and photons and so on. But I'm not necessarily saying that these are the fundamental constituents of reality. Maybe there's something even more fundamental to that we haven't discovered in our physics yet. But what I'm saying is something like that are the fundamental constituents of reality, and everything else that exists exists only in virtue of the particular arrangements and combinations of these fundamental units. So we can understand this with use of an analogy of a dot matrix image. So a dot matrix image, some of the older people in the audience may be more familiar with these, is essentially an image that's made up of just as a bunch of dots of varying sizes across the page. And that's all there is to the image. But by placing these dots in the right places and the correct relative sizes, you can form actually quite complex patterns, which have global properties, so like the relative shading, occlusion of objects, other things like that. The point, though, is that all of these higher order properties pertain or exist only in virtue of the pattern of dots. So this is stolen from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and I think this is a good way of putting it. So a dot matrix picture has these global properties like symmetry and cluttering and shading and stuff like that. But yet all there is to the picture is the dots and non-dots and their relative sizes at each of the points in the matrix. So all of the global properties are nothing but patterns in the dots. There's nothing else that make them exist. The technical phrase for this is they supervene. The higher order properties supervene on the patterns of the dots. That just means that they sit on top of, in a sense, exist because of the lower order patterns. No two pictures could differ in the global properties without differing somewhere in the pattern of the dots about where there is and where there isn't a dot. That's the basic idea of reductionism. Reductionism is saying everything is like this. Everything that exists, even the really high order complex stuff, exists purely in virtue of the arrangement of the fundamental things that make them up. Now, is this a plausible position? Because I'm saying that everything that exists, or everything that is true about reality, can be reduced ultimately to fundamental particles. So that includes things like love. Do we think it's plausible that we can reduce things like that to fundamental particles? Now, to understand how that could be plausible, I think it's useful to make a few clarifications. Firstly, I'm not making a semantic claim about mental content. That is, I'm not saying that when we think about higher order properties, like love, for example, or political institutions or whatever else, big complex things like that, I'm not saying that in our minds we have some idea about fundamental particles when we talk about those things. Because that's obviously wrong. We don't think in that way. So that's not what I'm saying. I'm also not saying, I'm not making an epistemological claim. That is, I'm not saying the way we find out about these higher order things like, say, love, is by looking at the fundamental particles and inferring them from the behavior. Again, that's obviously not how we work. Rather, what I'm doing is I'm making an ontological claim, and this is a word that you'll probably hear a lot tonight. Ontology is the fancy philosophical word which basically means the study of existence, or the things that exist, generally like at the most fundamental level. So an ontological claim is a claim about what exists, and I'm claiming that everything that exists does so purely in virtue, at bottom, of the particular arrangements and combinations and interactions of the fundamental building blocks of reality, particles and fields. So that's what my claim is. And to see how that applies to higher order things like love, it's useful, I think, to think about it as a stepwise process, because if you try and jump straight from love and other emotions and things like that to fundamental particles, it sounds silly. But if you do it in a stepwise way, I think you can see how this can make some sense. So we can start with the interactions of fundamental particles, follow the arrows here, and based on those interactions, we can describe how atomic orbitals, how different atomic orbitals are formed. And those different orbitals then give rise to the properties of atoms, which bind together to form chemical molecules. Different chemical molecules then clump up together and to form complex macromolecules like proteins, which then fold up to interact and form different organelles, which make up the different cells in our bodies, like the neuron shown here. Neurons then connect up together in local networks and then larger networks and conceptual patterns that underpin the activity, memories, and concepts and things like that we have in our minds, in our brains. Different systems in the brain and sensory apparatus and motor control and so on then have their own places where they're instantiated and different systems responsible for those. The nervous system, along with many other organ systems that exist in our body, the digestive and so on, go up to make an organism, a human being, and other animals. Then many humans interact together to form family networks and societies and political systems and so on. And then we go up to the higher order level of ecosystems and so on. So different stages in this sort of hierarchy roughly correspond to different scientific disciplines, and each has its own words that we use to describe that in sort of language. But the point is that each stage in the process, I'm arguing, can be understood to hold or pertain in virtue of the one below. And ultimately, we can press, if we wanted to, all the way back and say that all of these higher order properties pertain purely in virtue of the fundamental particles. So doing it in a stepwise manner like that, I think, helps to make a lot more sense of what I'm saying, rather than trying to think how very high order properties can be reduced straight to fundamental particles. Okay, to help with this, I'm going to introduce some vocabulary, which I've sort of stolen from physics, called macrostates and microstates. And that might sound a bit fancy, but the basic idea, I think, is reasonably straightforward. So a microstate is one single possible configuration of the fundamental particles or units in a system. A macrostate is a bunch or a set of the microstates that share some property or behavior of interest. So that might sound a bit hand-wavy, but if we give an example here, I think that should be clearer. So take the example of rolling 2 dice. A microstate is just one possible outcome of those 2 rolls, one particular way that they can come up. A macrostate is some property of the roll that we're interested in. In particular, in this case, it's going to be the sum of the numbers on the 2 die. So from the diagram here, you can see that some macrostates have many more ways of being instantiated than others. So in other words, there are many more ways of rolling a 7 than there are of rolling a 2 or a 12, because the number of microstates that correspond to the macrostate differs. And I think just looking at the diagram, you can see why. So that's a very simple example, the case of a dice. But what I'm saying is we can use this language of the microstates, the fundamental particles, and macrostates, sort of sets of configurations that bear some property of interest, to help us understand how this reductionism works. All right, so those are the key principles that I wanted to talk about, and I'll continue to flesh out throughout the evening. Naturalism, naturalism, nominalism, and reductionism. Now I want to take those and apply them to a case, in particular morality. So how we can understand morality as being part of or existing in the natural world. So according to the view that I'm advocating here, moral statements refer to complex sets of physical states. This position is known as ethical naturalism. And that shouldn't come as a surprise, because I'm saying that everything ultimately refers to complex sets of physical states. But how does that work exactly? So again, I'm not trying to give a full theory of morality here. All I'm trying to do is show how morality can fit within the metaphysical view of reductive naturalism that I'm outlining. So the basic idea is that morally good states of affairs are macrostates. They're sets of states of affairs that exist in the world. And morally good states of affairs are those that facilitate human flourishing and impede human misery. And those are obviously sort of vague ideas. I mean, exactly what is human flourishing and misery? But that doesn't matter, because as long as we can identify and find examples of human flourishing and human misery, and I think we can give lots of examples, and we can flesh out the properties and find intermediate cases and so on. As long as we can do that, then we know that we're referring to something that exists in the world, states of affairs in the world, some that facilitate human flourishing, some that impede misery, and others that do the reverse. So these are the macrostates. These are the moral states of affairs that we talk about when we talk about morality. These macrostates are then instantiated by particular microstates. These are specific ways of arranging, ultimately, the fundamental particles that make up the world. But you can look at the reduction in stages. You can look at the social and political institutions that give rise to morally good states of affairs. And then you could look at, say, the biology behind that, or the neuroscience behind that, or you could dig further and further down. Ultimately, all of these, according to my argument, are going to exist in virtue of the arrangements of fundamental particles. But when we're talking about the moral states of affairs, we're not really interested in those microstates. We're just interested in what the macrostate is looking like. Just as when we're talking about the die here, we're not really interested in exactly what the role is, we just want to know what the total sum is. Likewise with morality here, it's a macrostate, a very complex set of microstates that has a property of interest, namely that it supports human flourishing and impedes misery. So, understood in this way, morality is a real and objective aspect of the natural world. And I'm arguing we don't need anything beyond nature to account for its existence. Okay, so I've talked about 3 key principles of my worldview, naturalism, nominalism, and reductionism, and I've applied those to the case of morality to give you a sense of how this sort of works. And in my last 5 minutes, I want to give some reasons or advantages of this reductive naturalistic worldview. And the 3 ones that I want to focus on are parsimony, explanatory power, and ability to resolve certain paradoxes, or at least ease these paradoxes, you see what I mean. So let's start with parsimony. Naturalism, reductive naturalism, is a minimalist ontology, which means that it sort of just accepts the bare minimum, fundamental particles, and then the higher order things that are formed by combining those in different ways. Pretty much everyone agrees that these sorts of things exist, that they're part of the world, or at least that the natural world exists. The debate is sort of, does anything beyond that exist? So my argument is that if we can account for everything that we need to, that is all of the facets of reality and experience and whatever, if we can account for all of that using just the natural world, then there's no need to postulate anything beyond the natural world. This is the principle that Occam's raised, that you should not multiply entities beyond necessity. Or if we can explain everything that we need to using just the natural world, there's no need to say that anything beyond that exists. And this is similar to Laplace's idea, that we have no need for that hypothesis, that is of non-natural things in this case, to account for what we need to. This is not a decisive argument. It doesn't prove that nothing exists beyond the natural world. It just says that we don't have any reason, we don't have any need to posit such things. Okay, and the second argument that I want to raise, which is related to the first, is that of explanatory power. So, as I've discussed at the start of my talk, non-natural entities are usually understood to be in some way fundamentally mysterious, inexplicable, unusual, unpredictable, not subject to regular causal determinative laws. Now, if that's the case, then that means that entities like this, say deities for example, cannot give us explanatory power to account for other phenomena, because given an initial state, you don't know how they're going to behave, you don't know how they're going to react. You can't use their behaviour to explain why such and such is the case. I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. But the basic idea is that postulating these, so if we see here that the natural world, things that follow laws that we can describe, say, using physics and other sciences, and non-natural entities, which are intrinsically sort of mysterious and don't follow regular deterministic laws, then we can excise these non-natural entities from our ontology, and in doing so, we don't lose any explanatory power. That is, we haven't lost any ability to account for anything or any facet of the world or of reality, precisely because these things didn't follow any regular deterministic laws in the first place. We can't use them to explain why other things are the way they are. If we don't know how they behave, they're sort of mysterious because by their nature. Now again, that's not to say that they can't exist. All it's to say is that by their nature, it seems to me, cannot serve explanatory purposes, and therefore we don't have the same reason to posit their existence. So the final third argument that I want to give is that reductive naturalism helps us to resolve, or at least to dissolve or understand better certain paradoxes, particularly paradoxes of identity, and the most famous of which is the ship of Theseus, which some people here may have heard of. The basic idea is you take a ship, and over a period of time, you gradually replace individual planks and other components of the ship, sort of one at a time, until eventually you've replaced every individual component and you're left with ship A there. Now the first question is ship A the same as the ship of Theseus, the original one you started with? Are they the same? Or is it a new ship? And you can then extend that and ask, well, suppose we took all of these planks and these components that we're replacing and then gradually combine them to form a new ship, which at the end of it is made up of all of the original components from the original ship, and that's ship B. Is that the same as the ship of Theseus? So is A the ship of Theseus? Is B the ship of Theseus? Is A and B, are they the same ship or are they a different ship? This sort of paradox and other related ones relate to personal identity through time and the identity of things through change and things like that have plagued philosophy for a long time. And I'm arguing that a lot of the trouble about these paradoxes arises because what we're doing is granting complex macroscopic objects like ships or people or other things like that, we're granting them a fundamental standing in our ontology. We're saying that they exist alongside, say, fundamental particles that make them up. And that leads to a problem because we're trying to ask, well, when does the ship of Theseus exist? When is it in our ontology? What is the sort of essence or the fundamental thing that corresponds to? And then at what point does it cease to exist and then A exists? Or is A the same thing? It gets all confused. it seems to me that a much more natural way, or a much better way of making sense of this is to use the language of macrostates, where we can talk about how narrowly or broadly our concepts are defined. The reason a reductionist understanding of using macrostates is helpful is because we can say, for example, okay, the ship of Theseus is a concept, and we can say that anything that is sort of sufficiently close to this concept instantiates that. And so the ship of Theseus would obviously, the original ship fits that concept. Maybe ship A is close enough to that concept to fit within the category, maybe it's not. So we're going to have debates obviously about exactly the scope of our concept. But my point here is that this reductionistic framework reframes the debate in terms of, instead of what exists, it's asking how do our concepts apply, or it turns it into a semantic dispute. And this is important because you can talk about concepts as being graded. You know, ship A is more or less like the original ship of Theseus, and ship B is more or less like ship A, and so on, how our various criteria apply. You can't do that with ontology. Something can't partially exist and partially not exist. It's either in our ontology, in our set of things that exist, or it's not. And then you have to ask questions like, well, when does it cease to be out there, and how does one thing change into another thing? And it gets all rather confused. I think a reductive naturalist way of understanding this is helps to resolve these problems. So, I'm out of time. That's what I've talked about tonight, my 3 key principles of naturalism, nominalism, and reductionism. I apply that to morality, and I gave 3 arguments in favour of reductive naturalism, and this case I will build on throughout the evening. So, thank you for listening.
I'm now going to give Leon 20 minutes to make his opening remarks as well, so please join with me in welcoming him.
Okay. So, first of all, thanks for the invitation to this debate. James spoke about 3 principles of his worldview, and I should say that the idea for this debate came from the fact that James gave a talk outlining his worldview at a recent sort of humanism, secularism conference. And we were thinking of a debate topic, and I thought, wow, I can think of 3 things that pretty much exactly parallel what James talked about in that talk, but sort of the opposite. So in place of reductionism, I'm going to talk about hylomorphism, which is a different way of understanding how ordinary objects sort of relate to smaller objects, and the way that things like people relate to things like atoms, and if there is sort of a fundamental substrate. James spoke about nominalism, about universals, and I'm going to argue for realism about universals. And James talked about naturalism or physicalism, and I'm going to argue for classical theism, which is basically a particular way to understand that there is a God. Or I should actually say that God exists. There's a slight difference there. Okay, so first of all, hylomorphism as an alternative to reductionist physicalism. Here are the points that I want to make. Okay, that's annoying. That's going to possibly keep coming up. Okay, here are the points that I want to make. About hylomorphism. So first of all, our conception of what the physical substrate is, the fundamental particles or fields or whatever, has changed radically over time, and we don't yet understand it fully. Okay, but the sciences, including those that deal with classification, so things like biology, even chemistry, deliver truth about the world. So these must be grounded in something other than the physical substrate, and form is the principle that makes sense of this. Another point I'll make is that practicing scientists use terms like information and function, talk about purpose, and these are most naturally understood through this form concept. And finally, I'll argue that reductionism at least tends towards eliminativism, which is absurd. And that's the view that sort of higher level structures above fundamental particles, fields, and so on, in some sense don't really exist. So here's another way of sort of describing what I understand to be the reductionist view. I hope this is what James means by it, but the idea is that reality can be described in this sort of way. You've got your fundamental particles or fields, there's a picture of the standard model there. You've got your laws which govern them. You've got constants, which are basically sort of numbers that plug into those laws and are pretty well fixed. And then you've got boundary conditions, and they basically describe sort of the actual arrangement of all the particles and things like that exist in our world. Okay. And claim almost all of science actually lives in here, in the sense that it pretty much depends on the boundary conditions, but the fundamental particles or fields, the laws and the constants, in some sense they could have turned out differently. We could have discovered different things, and in fact there's probably still more for us to discover about it. Okay, similarly, there have been drastic changes through history in our best theories of what the atoms of the physical substrate are like. So, you know, at times they've been thought to be continuous, at times discrete, at times wave-like, at times particle-like. There's been, you know, debate over the existence of nature of the vacuum, so whether there's sort of real nothingness or not. And another massive difference is whether, you know, these particles or fields or whatever they are just interact sort of locally with one another, or whether they can interact over sort of massive distances. Excuse me. So, for example, in Newtonian physics, as opposed to in general relativity, things can sort of, well, influence each other at, you know, at massive distances, and there are phenomena like quantum entanglement that are, you know, quite sort of weird. And I also want to make the point that in some sense we don't actually know what the basic substrate is. So, you know, fundamental physics as it's currently understood is incomplete in various ways. There are things like, you know, the existence of dark matter and dark energy. There's inconsistencies between the standard model of particle physics and general relativity and so on. The point I'm making here is not that we should give up hope of a final theory or that we should stop doing particle physics, but rather that, again, our conception of the physical substrate is incomplete, it's changed radically over time, and can't really change the science we already know. So the sciences, including physics, have delivered and continue to deliver truth about our universe. So we need a principle to account for this over and above just the fundamental particles or substrate. And the theory I'm suggesting for this is something called it's spelled incorrectly. It's not hypermorphism, it's hylomorphism. That's a little unfortunate. It's the idea that ordinary objects are a composite of sort of two broad principles, form and matter. So to explain this, I've got here 3 pictures of Jeremy Bentham, a famous philosopher and utilitarian philosopher and progressive activist. Here's a portrait of him as a young man. Here's his corpse, which he donated to science, and which sits in University College London for all perpetuity. And here is sort of a schematic image for what would happen if we took Jeremy Bentham and separated him into his constituent elements. You know, 65% oxygen, 18% carbon, you know, 10% carbon. So you can imagine us sort of keeping these in jars or something like that. Now, what is the difference between these 3 Jeremy Benthams? So on the theory of hylomorphism, which was basically put forward by Aristotle, the difference is their form. In some sense, they have the same matter, at least with respect to their chemical composition, they have the same matter. And they could, okay, this is not actually scientifically true, but you know, hypothetically, they assume that this was taken just before Bentham died. They could be made up of the very same atoms, yet they're radically different as things. So Aristotle, basically argued that there's this principle called form, which makes something what it is, and another principle called matter, which instantiates it as a particular thing and allows it to change. For example, from being alive to dead, and you know, from being a coherent composite thing to being separated into jars. So something that I would add to the standard reductionist picture is that there's some extra element, there's this form that goes into things as they become more and more complex. Here's a great quote about form from a writer I love called G.K. Chesterton. And you're not supposed to do this with slides, but I'm just going to sort of read a big quote off the slide. But I'll read the bits in bold, okay? Matter is the more mysterious and indefinite and featureless element in the universe, and what stamps anything with its own identity is its form. Matter, so to speak, is not so much the solid as the liquid or gaseous thing in the cosmos. And in this, most scientists are beginning to agree with him, that is Aquinas, who was a philosopher and follower of Aristotle in many things. But the form is the fact. It's that which makes a brick, a bust, and not the shapeless and trampled clay of which either may be made. So a great example of this is sort of these two allotropes of carbon, diamond and graphite. They differ quite radically in their features, in their powers. You know, you can, in their ability to scratch things, you know, in their colour, in their lustre, all of which I would say are real features of the universe and are accounted for by form rather than the specific type of atom that the particular substance is made up of. Okay, and here's another example, right? Chemistry, the periodic table. This is a classic example of a science which sort of classifies things that are not now, it turns out, fundamental particles, but there is a huge amount of structure which I would account for using the language of form at this level of reality. Chemistry delivers us truth about reality, and we didn't have to know about more fundamental physical particles to learn about chemistry. And the same goes for biology and the classification of organisms. So this is just a table from Linnaeus, who was one of the first to, sort of the originator of our current system of classifying animals, plants, and so on. Okay, so here's another thing that I would say that materialism, naturalism, physicalism struggles to take account of, and that is phenomena or things like purpose, information, function, words like this that are used all the time in science, but that don't have an obvious physicalist or materialist translation. So here's a quote from Richard Dawkins. I'm again just going to read off the slide. It's from the book The Ancestor's Tale. It says, "It's raining DNA outside. Downy seeds from willow trees. The cotton wool is mostly made of cellulose, and it dwarfs the tiny capsule that contains the DNA, the genetic information. The DNA content must be a small proportion of the total. So why did I say that it was raining DNA outside rather than cellulose? The answer is that it is the DNA that matters, whose coded characters spell out specific instructions for building willow trees. It's raining instructions out there, it's raining programs. It is raining tree-growing, fluff-spreading algorithms. This is not a metaphor, it's the plain truth. It couldn't be any plainer if it were raining floppy disks." Amazing quote. I actually came across it though through a blog post of a philosopher of science called John Wilkins, who is now based at this university actually. And he was arguing against it. Okay, so the post is titled, "Information is the New Aristotelianism, and Dawkins is a hylomorphist." And he thinks these things are wrong. So he says, information causes nothing at all. An abstraction cannot cause a physical process, and to think otherwise is a category error. Unfortunately common among theoreticians, so it means like practicing scientists, as well as intelligent designists, by which it means people advocate intelligent design. It's time that we stopped making this mistake in science. It's time that we give up on hylomorphisms, old or new. In the end, these metaphors, and they are metaphors, only mislead us. Okay, and his joke at the end, I think that's enough of that information for me, too much information. Now, this is quite odd for me because, I work in a field, bioinformatics, where in fact we use terms like function, information, and so on all the time. In fact, I would say that the whole field is basically defined by the fact that we now have machines, like this nice sequence here, that can convert information in DNA into sort of information of the kind that we store in computers, and therefore help us to understand biological function. Okay, finally my last point, which is about eliminativism. So this is the idea that, reductionism tends toward eliminativism, which is absurd. Okay, here's a quote from a guy called Quine. I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but let's just, except to say that basically what he says is that ordinary objects are like Greek gods. The difference between them is not really qualitative, it's just a matter of degree. Both of them are just sort of hypothetical posits that, sort of hypothetical things that we posit in order to kind of make sense of the flux of experience. But essentially the categories that we use to talk about ordinary objects are basically just a way of helping us to get by. They don't necessarily track fundamental things in nature. And here's another sort of quote from a philosopher who leans towards eliminativism, Alex Rosenberg. This is from an interview of his on a blog called Talking Philosophy, and basically you can read it in the question. Ultimately, science and scientism are going to make us give up as illusory the very thing conscious experience screams out at its loudest and longest. The notion that when we think, our thoughts are about anything at all, inside of or outside of our minds. Okay, so I don't think that, you know, reductionism sort of necessarily leads you here, but I think that if you are a reductionist, it's important to explain why you're not an eliminativist about information, function, purpose, and intention when these concepts do actually enter into both common sense and natural science. Okay, so here's a recap of the points that I've made about hylomorphism and naturalism. Okay, so realism about universals as an alternative to nominalism. So this is the view that universals reflect nature's joints, quote unquote, and are not just a matter of human convenience or utility or like a choice of resolution at which we decide to look at nature. So in support of this, I'll claim that the sciences aim to understand and classify various universals, and also that mathematical structures like, you know, circularity, three, that kind of thing, actually exist instantiated in reality, and that realism about universals is a good theory to explain this. Okay, so just to recap, although James covered this already, what are universals? They're things like hardness or softness, greenness, three, roundness. They're basically things that apply to multiple particulars or individuals or sets of them. They can be quantitative, they can be qualitative. And the classic realist view of universals is that they, quote, carve nature at its joints, unquote, and are not just a matter of convenience and usefulness. And here's the original dialogue by Plato from which that language comes. They're talking about the definition of love. And Socrates says, you know, there are two principles when you're thinking about coming up with a universal. The first is the comprehension of scattered particulars in one idea. And the second is that you divide things according to the natural formation of where the joint is, not breaking any part as a bad carver might. Okay, and here's a quote in favour of science being about universals. Okay, science is about universals. I'm just going to read the quote again, sorry, bad practice, but there is a perception of universals. Indeed, it's universals that have causal power. We perceive an individual stone, but only as a certain shape, colour, and weight, because it is these properties that confer on the power to affect our senses. Okay, and I'll just skip a sentence. Science gives us classification and understanding of the universals we perceive and finds the laws connecting them. Physics deals with, you know, certain properties, biology with others, psychology with others, and mathematics with others still. I mention mathematics because there is this sort of a bit of a confusion in the philosophy of mathematics that persists to this day about what makes mathematical statements true. So Platonism is the view that mathematical truths are sort of true because there's like a mathematical realm to which, you know, concepts like three, you know, coordinate systems, that kind of thing refer. And mathematical statements are true because they're true in that world. On the other hand, another very common philosophy of maths is formalism, which is basically the idea that maths is just about manipulating symbols. And that, but on this view, according to sort of rules that we come up with, on this view though, it's hard to see how mathematics is sort of true of anything. On the other hand, I would say that a health sort of intermediate view is that mathematical statements are true in virtue of real world structure and form. Possibly actual, possibly potential. So here's an example of a problem that was solved by Leonard Euler. It's called the Seven Bridges of Königsberg. It's basically the question, can you walk across all the 7 bridges in the city, only traversing each once? And he basically proved that you couldn't. Now that's a mathematical fact about, you know, graphs, which are sort of the abstract mathematical structure, but it is also proving a fact about the world. So basically I would say that form and structure and mathematical universals somehow exist instantiated in our world, and this is sort of an important explanatory principle as to how science works. Okay. Now in the last 3 minutes, I'm going to talk about classical theism as an alternative to naturalism or physicalism. So, theism means the view that God exists. And at this point, I want to distinguish between what's called classical and so-called personalist theism. So, classical theism is basically the view that what distinguishes God is ultimacy. That God is basically the ultimate. So, for example, God is completely simple, unchanging. To the extent that God is personal, God is sort of super personal. You know, it has something like will and intellect. Whereas on the personalist theism view, it tends to conceive of God as like a disembodied mind, and tends to believe that we can describe, like we can predicate will and intellect and other things of God in a non-analogical way. So in other words, just directly, God is sort of has a will in the same way that you or I have a will. God is intelligent in the same way that you or I are intelligent. And classical theism would tend to deny that. And just to sort of explain, there are some questions unanswered by classical theism, like, are there lowercase g gods? You know, like the Greek gods. And in fact, many Greeks believed both in a classical theist conception of God and in lowercase g gods. Should humans care about God or seek God? Does God care about us? Has God revealed himself to us? I'm not going to answer those questions. I'm also not going to make a fine-tuning argument which focuses on the constants in this reductionist picture. Rather, I'm going to argue that, you know, on reductionism, boundary conditions of the universe, or the way, many aspects of the way things are treated as sort of chaos or just brute facts that are not in need of explanation. On the other hand, it is legitimate to ask for an explanation of why things are the way they are in this sense. So here's an article by a guy called Derek Parfit, not a religious thinker, not a theist, called Why Anything Like This, in which he basically argues that it is reasonable to ask the question, why does the universe exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And why does this particular universe exist? You know, with these features. So here are some example answers. One is that everything that could exist, possibly exist, exists. He calls this the all worlds view. One is that nothing exists. He doesn't accept either of those views. Another possibility that sort of lies, most of the possibilities are intermediate between those. One that he hypothesizes is something called the axiarchic view, which is that there's some like principle of reality according to which what exists is sort of best. And cosmological arguments for the existence of God basically say that the explanation and ground of this contingency, that is things that could be one way or the other, is a being that exists necessarily. At this point, I just want to highlight some thinkers who are not Christians, who are not conventionally religious, who have argued for this. So there's a book called Purpose in the Universe by a guy called Tim Mulgan, who's a New Zealand philosopher. Basically argues the case against atheism, the case against benevolent theism, that is that God actually cares specifically about human beings, and then argues for a kind of morality based on this. Similarly, this is a book by a guy called David Conway, called Rediscovery of Wisdom, which is basically an attempt to defend this, an old classical theist view like this. And yes, basically along the lines that I described. So, in summary, it is a legitimate question why the universe exists and has the form that it does. The cosmological argument is that the only answer that sort of really well makes sense of this is that a necessary being. And this argument, along with other similar arguments, lead one to classical theism. That is that in the same way contingent is grounded in a necessary being, what the change in the universe is grounded in something eternal and unchanging, and composition is grounded in something unified. And all these things are basically what you mean when we refer to God. Okay, I just want to make a couple of final points. First of all, that physicalism and classical theism are both about grounding and fundamentality, and both of them go beyond what's known by current physical science. I also want to make the point that, have I run out of time? Oh, okay, great. That both of these views have a long historical pedigree, and so in some sense I don't think that physicalism or materialism or naturalism can entirely be grounded in what science sort of has discovered in the last 500 years. Okay, Finally, morality, which I may have to discuss later in my rebuttal. I want to talk about something called natural law morality as an example application of this view of the world. So on natural law, morality is practical reason in light of what is objectively good for us as humans. Okay? It's grounded in human form, function, and purpose. It is not reducible to happiness or desire fulfillment. It's comparable with and an extension of the concept of health, right? That we generally think of as mostly objective. It's also comparable with what is objectively good for plants and animals, but it's different for humans due to our rationality. This is something that we don't share with animals. Okay, I will skip this. Except to say that I think here are two things that you would want from a theory of morality. One is that it is binding on us in some way. That it's not dependent on the desires we happen to have or arbitrary conceptual schemes we happen to have. And so morality can actually correct those. And also that it's motivating. In other words, we have practical reasons to be moral. And I claim that it's difficult to ground morality in this sense without something like form, function, or teleology in your basic ontology of reality. If you do that, I think you tend to end up with sort of realism in name only. And in fact, many physicalists, reductionist materialists, have basically argued that morality isn't real. And I think that is a very plausible conclusion on that worldview. Okay, I can actually see that I've been going for 23 minutes, and I think that's more than the funny problems with the slide. So thank you, everyone.
And both speakers are just going to have a little bit to work out their rebutting points. I'm going to give them each 10 minutes. But in the time before James comes up to give his 10-minute remarks, that number is still on the board, and I can introduce to you just some of the themes that we'll be accepting, themes of questions, now that you've seen the introductory points. If you can make your questions something along the lines of naturalism versus theism, reductionism versus non-reductionism or hylomorphism, and nominalism versus reduction of the universals, right? So, realism, yeah, I can't even read my own writing. One of those. Then we'll take those questions, but I'll only be taking the ones that really sort of fit into that because we have that 50/45 minutes of moderated debate. So be sending those in anywhere from now on until the debate, and I'll be reading those out. Anyway, that's enough from me. Here's James, and he's going to be giving 10 minutes on these.
I don't bring my watches on, so I just have to hope the signal lets me know how much time I have. So, thanks, Leon, for those remarks. So what I'm going to be talking about is, I hope we get here late. What I'm going to talk about in these 10 minutes is basically a response to what Leon said in light of my initial remarks. So, sort of how to respond from the perspective of my worldview toward the perspective that Leon's presented. And I want to start by looking at hylomorphism versus reductionism, because I think that's the most important difference, and it sort of encapsulates a number of the other issues. So some of the things that Leon brought up with regard to why hylomorphism is a more plausible theory is that our ideas about what the fundamental substrate is have changed over time, and that also related to that we can learn things in sciences, like chemistry, biology, and so on, without needing to know all of the facts about the underlying fundamental constituents that make up those higher order things. And yes, and we still don't know, related to that, we still don't know, as Leon said, what the fundamental substrate is because we don't have a complete theory of physics. All of those points I grant, but what I want to say is that these issues are tangential to what I'm talking about tonight. If you recall, I mentioned at the start of my remarks that in my remarks about reductionism, actually I'll flip back to the slide, that I'm not making either a semantic claim about mental content or an epistemological claim about knowledge. So my point is simply about what is the ontological basis of higher order properties. So I'm saying that all of the higher order things that exist and all of the things that we study in chemistry and biology and higher order subjects pertain in virtue of fundamental particles and their interactions. For that to be true, we don't need to know what those fundamental particles are. We don't need to know much necessarily about how they interact, although it might help, but we don't necessarily need to know that. These are epistemological points, not about the point of what exists. So I think that that's a red herring in the sense that it's not directly relevant to the point as to what is the basis of existence. And likewise, when I'm talking about the difference between microstates and macrostates, we understand macrostates in some sense as analogous to the forms that Leon talked about. They're not precisely the same, but there's some analogy there. And as Leon said, most of what we do when we study in science and other disciplines is that we're studying the structure and the way that sort of stuff is put together and the way it behaves. And this, according to my understanding, would be study of the macrostate. And you don't necessarily need to know much of anything about the underlying microstates to study the macrostate. That's actually the point, in some sense, of this mental dichotomy that we're making. We're using that dichotomy to understand the relationships between things, that the higher order stuff is ultimately made true by all of the microstates, but we don't need to know about that, or even we don't even always need to think about that in order to work at a higher level and work with our macrostates. And that's where most science operates, and that's perfectly fine, and we get a long ways doing that. But when it comes to the philosophical questions about, well, what makes things true and what's at the fundamental basis of existence, that's where I'm saying that the reductionism part comes in. So that's an ontological claim. It's not a claim about how we do science, it's not a claim about how we come to knowledge, and it's not a claim about how we form our mental categories about higher order things. Leon also mentioned the point about concepts like information and intentionality, purpose, and other things like that, how they fit into a reductionistic worldview. You probably won't be that surprised to hear that I would say that these are all examples, effectively, of macrostates, that they are ways of conceptualizing things that exist in the world. So I'm not going to go through and give a theory as to what all of these things are, because that would take far longer than we have, and I don't think we're all the way there yet, because we're still trying to work out exactly what these things are, you know, intentionality, information, and these things. There's a lot of theorizing that goes on about this. But my point is we can theorize about these concepts, and we can use them productively in a discourse without needing to have a precise reductive account as to exactly how the microstates make them true. My claim is simply that that all of these things are true purely in virtue of the way fundamental particles are arranged. And that's the sort of thesis that I'm advancing this evening. And my fundamental point is, if we can understand the fact of higher order, more complex things being coming into being purely by the interaction of fundamental particles and the way they are arranged, then why do we need to posit anything existing beyond that? Okay, so that's some points about hylomorphism. I also wanted to make some points about this. Let's skip forward a little bit. How are we going, Stephen, for time? 5. Okay, good. About universals and the concept of carving nature at its joints, because this is the concept that the sort of metaphor that Leon used. This is also directly related to the idea of reductionism. Now, my basic point is that I don't see that nature has joints in the way that Leon thinks that it does. And I've given some examples on this slide that it seems very hard, perhaps impossible, I would argue probably impossible in principle, to give precise definitions of any complex objects that we study in science or in outside of science. So I've just given a few examples here. Maybe I won't talk about all of these, but I'll take a couple, like a planet, for example. Some of you may be familiar that a few years ago, Pluto was recategorized because a formal definition of planet was devised that included the third criterion you see there, that a planet clears its neighborhood around the orbital path of other bodies. Pluto doesn't meet that criteria. Now, this definition of a planet is essentially arbitrary. Well, that's a bit strong. It's not arbitrary. There are reasons for it, but the point is it's not based on a fundamental analysis of where the joints are in nature, because when we look out in the world, we see that there's all sorts of bodies orbiting around the sun in all sorts of orbits, of all sorts of sizes, in all sorts of complicated ways. And where you want to carve it up and call one a planet and one an asteroid and one a minor planet is really up to how we apply our concepts. In other words, it's a semantic point about how we define our macrostates. And it seems to me that if Leon wants to say that we're carving nature at its joints, we have to work out, well, where are the joints of nature and how do they fit into our ontology? Like, if a planet's a universal that exists somewhere in ontology, distinct from a meteor, and if so, how is that distinction instantiated in the world? It just seems to me there isn't anything there. There are no joints. There are phenomena that we can understand using our macrostate concepts, but not these sort of precise joints that I think Leon's appealing to. And similarly, I think it applies to species in biology, where, again, you have, in practice, well, in reality, a sort of clean clean's not the right word, a clear linkage between each subsequent generation. The usual definition of a species involves the concept of reproductive isolation, that two populations can't interbreed with each other. But of course, the idea of common descent is that all currently living organisms descend from the same common ancestor. So at each generation, there's the ability to interbreed with the previous one, and there's a continuity of life right across down through evolutionary history. And the distinctions, the precise distinctions that we make between one species and another, again, largely arbitrary, and there, as a result, is no precise definition of what exactly a species is. Again, I say arbitrary, that's a bit too strong, because there are reasons for the distinctions that we make, but they do not, I think, correspond to these natural kinds that exist somewhere in our fundamental ontology, because then you just don't have these clean demarcations between the one species and the other, the two different things existing on our ontology. What we have is lots of different animals and ways of categorizing them, and these ways correspond to our macrostates, and the job of biology essentially is to come up with effective ways of doing that. But again, I just don't see these sort of cleanly demarcated joints there. I've got some other examples, but I'll skip those. So my basic point is I think that a look at the sciences shows me that it doesn't seem to me that there are these sort of natural kinds, that reality just doesn't seem to behave that way, and that understanding our higher order concepts in terms of macrostates, that we then, concepts that we apply to talk about complex things, is a more sensible way of thinking about it. Now, final point, how many minutes do I have? 2 minutes, good. In 2 minutes I can talk about classical theism. So Leon talked about the explanatory part of theism, particularly with reference to like why anything, why this. Why does this particular universe exist as opposed to some other universe? Now, I don't have an answer to that question, but what I'm questioning here is whether Leon has or more to the point, whether classical theism has an answer to this question, because it seems to me that God is not a very effective mechanism for providing explanations. God is supposed to be all-powerful, he can do anything. And this means that any possible outcome is equally consistent with God bringing that about. So the diagram here is just supposed to illustrate that whether A, B, or C, maybe those could be possible ways the universe could be. There could be, zillions more of those. Any possible universe could equally be explained by, oh, God made it that way. But then if you can explain every possible universe that way, there's no way of picking out any particular universe and saying, but why is it this way and not the other way? Because God could have made it any other way he wanted. That's the problem with appealing to God. Because he's all-powerful and has the ability to do anything that's logically possible, there's no ability to narrow down anything and say, well, this is why it's this way and not the other way. The only way I can think of around this is to have a theology, or in other words, a theory about what God is liable to do, what he wants, what his purposes are, and so on. But that, first of all, is outside of the reasons that I'm talking about. That is philosophical and scientific reasons. I don't purport to know what would be in God's mind if he existed. The second point, though, is that it seems that for everything you're going to try and explain, you're going to need to posit a new divine intention or purpose or something like that. Like, why is the mass of the electron what it is? Well, God wanted it that way. Well, okay, but what about the mass of this other particle? Or what about the entropy of the early universe? Or any other random property you can think of? Oh, well, God decided it could be that way. So then you need to posit, well, he wanted it to be that way, and then he wanted this other thing to be that way. Why did he intervene to resurrect a particular person in history, which Leon hasn't talked about? But again, another example. You have to say, well, he wanted to do that. The point is, because he could do anything for any particular thing you're saying he actually did, you have to posit, well, he wanted to do that. And that just means that you don't have a simple explanation. For everything you're trying to explain, you have to posit a new motivation or a new desire. Or perhaps come up with a very good theology which puts all these things together. Maybe that can be done. But philosophically, I don't think it's a very good way of trying to explain things. So I imagine I'm out of time, so I'll just conclude there, and thank you.
Stephen, is the only way to ask questions by texting them in?
Oh, yeah, you can just whisper to me.
Or can we not ask questions like later on?
Well, I'm sure it's asked speakers. Is that going to be
born out of bitter experience at both of us at bigger events where questions are sort of tend to be essays.
Usually we opt for this medium because sometimes, we have had people sort of very passionately read out entire essays that they've written during the speakers talking, so we sort of try and avoid that. But I will putting out my thoughts. I will Stephen, you're the moderator. I will decide. I'll probably take it. Anyway, that being said, I'm going to invite Leon up to do his 10 minutes of rebuttal. And as always, Leon, I'll give a knock on the disc to 5 minutes.
So is there a webcam on test messages?
160 minutes.
Can I get email instead?
Yeah. Okay. So, I don't have extra slides to show. Okay. So, first of all, I'll just sort of state some sort of rebuttal to the rebuttal, so to speak, and then ask some questions. Yeah, say some questions I have for James's view. So the first is James sort of talked about this ontology epistemology distinction, and therefore argued that this and used that to argue that that this question about that the argument I made that science has delivered us all this truth without us knowing about fundamental particles is a bit of a red herring. I suppose I have a couple of responses to this. First is that I think ontology and epistemology are fundamentally linked. That is, what you believe we know and what you believe exists. And James's view is in some sense a fairly radical, minimal view about what exists. And I think that what we know and what we've come to know and how we've come to know it has a very important and close connection with what exists. So I don't think it's entirely a red herring. And maybe a question that would help sort of disambiguate this is, to James, is do you think that it's plausible that there's like an infinite hierarchy of smaller and smaller and smaller fundamental particles? That the structure of reality doesn't sort of bottom out in the way that you hypothesize. I think that would, on that view, there may not be there may not be a sort of most fundamental layer of unknown quarks or something like that. And then I think you would need this form concept or something like it in order to account for what we do know. Okay. Another thing on reductionism is just that dot matrix printer image or analogy. So I think a better analogy would actually be, given the fact that we don't yet know what the fundamental particles are, a better analogy would be an image where we couldn't see the dots, right? So an image where we couldn't actually see the dots. And I think what the reductionist claim is on that analogy is, there's something to the word Oki data, or whatever it was, to be explained apart from any dots that may exist. And James would want us, I think, or the reductionists would want to say there's nothing but patterns in the dots. I think what I'm saying is we don't know if there are dots, and patterns covers almost everything important about the image. Okay. Now, just on sort of realism about universals and carving nature at its joints. James brought up a bunch of examples of sort of where classification is fuzzy, or it's hard to know exactly, there aren't a sharp boundary between things, like species. And I would say that not all classification is fuzzy, but also, classification is fuzzy, but not all of it is. And I don't think it's good to sort of judge a concept just by, the kind of near exceptions. So for example, species are fuzzy in some sense, the boundary between species. But when you look at it at a larger scale, the difference between unicellular and multicellular organisms, for example, or the difference between a human and a bacterium, they're quite radical. And I would say they're qualitative differences, not just quantitative. It's not like, I'll just leave that. James said at some point, that the distinctions we make are not arbitrary, there are reasons for them. But I want to know sort of what are those reasons in James's ontology. Another example is this question that Lewis Carroll asks, I think in Alice in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass, which is, what is the difference between a raven and a writing desk? Right? There's basically, it's put in the form of a joke by someone, but then they sort of don't actually mean it as a joke, they mean it as a question. And I think the point of the question is that there's basically, normally with a joke, there's sort of something, there's some small difference between them or something like that, but in fact there's almost nothing in common. It's not like you can sort of find something that's exactly halfway between a raven and a writing desk, for example. So, the space of possible universals is not just sort of some completely continuous thing that we can move about in freely. There are sort of distinctions to be drawn. There are qualitative distinctions there. Okay. How long have I got, Stephen?
We've got 5 minutes. That's it.
Great. That's enough. Great. Okay. Let's have a think. Right, another point in James's rebuttal is about God and explanation. So I think what I'd say to this is that grounding is not the same as explanation, which is not the same as prediction. But I admit that God is sort of quite a mysterious idea, especially the classical theist God. It's not like, we can get sort of an image in our head of what God is like. James also made the point that God doesn't explain anything unless you've already got a theology. But I think part of the point of the arguments that I've been making is that in fact we have a theology based on how the world is. In other words, we can know of God that God created a universe in which which is huge, and in which humans, who are in some respects quite radically different from anything else we know of in the universe, came to be. So I don't think that theology is sort of entirely a black box in which you can just stuff anything into, or that or that sort of God doesn't do anything in some sense on this view. But I mean, I think as well, in some sense, both reductionism and theism sort of explain everything. That they both try to explain everything, and so it's hard to see how, in some sense, they don't also explain nothing. I acknowledge that, and perhaps I just don't have an answer for it. Okay, so some questions I'd like to ask James are: do you think that you claim that you don't know about why the universe is the way it is? Do you think that that's a legitimate question, or an answerable in principle question, or a question sort of should have an answer, or a question that sort of definitely has no answer? Because one way I think about reductionism is that it seems to close the door on possible answers to this question, or this kind of question. And I think of theism as being, in some sense, positing itself as the only possible answer to this question, the only coherent answer. I'm also interested to know how James thinks about mathematics, because I think mathematics studies universals. And this is another thing with the carving nature of its joints. Right? I think I gave a very clear example of a universal in the Bridges of Königsberg problem, where the structure of that city corresponds exactly to this mathematical structure, such that you can prove things about physical reality, about that city, and what you can do with that city based on its structure. So, on those grounds, I would say the structure is sort of real and non-arbitrary either. It's not like, maybe you could sort of maybe you could sort of walk across the bridges without covering the same bridge twice, but it's sort of arbitrary whereas bridges are, whatever. It's not like that. It's actually just a pretty clear fact that you can prove mathematically about reality, and I would say it relies on this higher order structure. Okay, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So that comfortably concludes the bulk of the debate. Thank you for coming along. We're going to now go to a 45-minute, I think we're running bang on time actually, yeah. 45-minute moderated discussion. So as I said before, I'm just going to go to questions that I pick up on the text. Thank you for coming. I pick up from the text that you provided. And I think I'll start with this one actually. This is somewhat for both of our speakers. It's a question that's been asked in different ways by about 3 of you, so I thought I'd bring it up. It's about defining form and macrostates. And I think I'll give this to Leon first because you introduced form. Does form equal macrostates, or what is the difference between your form and James's macrostates?
Okay, so I would say one difference. I would say that I'm positing form as sort of a fundamental principle or thing that we should include in our account of the universe. And I think a big difference is sort of summarised in that Chesterton quote, where I think form is actually the more concrete thing, the thing that sort of accounts for most of the properties of the world as we know it. And I think it's part of sort of the basic furniture of the universe. So maybe one way to get at this distinction is that I can imagine it being the case that there is no physical substrate, that there are no sort of fundamental particles, and maybe there's just sort of some sort of continuous substrate that can take on infinitely many different forms, or maybe you keep looking deeper and deeper, and we keep coming up with more and more different kinds of fundamental particles. If reality is like that, then I would say that to account for the way things are, you need something like form, because there wouldn't be fundamental particles for you to appeal to. So I'd say that's a key difference.
And James, is there anything that you wanted to define?
So on that, it seems to me that the fundamental particles that I talk about would be analogous to the matter in hylomorphism, not to form.
Yeah.
So if we're going to imagine a universe in which just sort of has many layers continually downwards, that would seem to be inconsistent with hylomorphism as well, because there's supposed to be some sort of substrate.
Yeah, so something I didn't mention is, oh sorry, I'm not sure we can keep talking about this.
No, we can.
Something I didn't mention is that in Aquinas, for example, who followed Aristotle in a lot of ways, he had this idea of prime matter, which is sort of what you get to right down to the bottom, so to speak. But he also thought that in some sense prime matter doesn't really exist. All it does is instantiate things and let them change. But in some sense, it doesn't really exist as its own sort of fundamental thing. So, yeah.
Could I ask a clarifying question on this?
You might.
So, kind of two questions. One is, to what extent do you think, to what extent do you think your understanding of form might be understood as non-arbitrary macro structures, i.e., so non-arbitrary configurations? So one of the points James made is that his idea of macrostructures are particular combinations of macroforms, macroforms are particular configurations of microforms that interest us, or, so for dice it could be the value, but it could also be some other characteristic that, two dice. So to what extent do you think, perhaps, that your understanding of forms might be a non-arbitrary?
Yeah, so so I can think of, I think I agree with that. I mean, I think another difference with macrostates is that, form is sort of, in some sense, it can also be relative to the next layer down.
Yes, that's the other.
Without there necessarily being a bottom layer. So
yeah, you don't have to go all the way down.
That's right, but I think non-arbitrariness is probably the big thing as well. Closely connected with the universe.
So the point that, sorry, I'll just pick up on that, because one of the things you asked me or mentioned is that what is it? So I said the macrostates are not arbitrary, but they're also not given by the joints of nature. So what do I mean by that? I just want to clarify that. What I mean is that we define and use macrostates in so much as they serve our purposes, and that's a very hand-wavy thing to say, right? But it has to be, because it depends so much on exactly what you're talking about. So many of the all the different sciences and scientific disciplines have their own methods of approaching the question and their own accepted methodologies and forms of explanation and so on. And so it's within those contexts, within those particular institutional contexts, that we formulate categorizations and we apply them. And so, often those serve like concrete purposes in terms of technologies or managing systems. Not always. Sometimes they can serve just conceptual purposes. And often, when that's the case, then there are competing classifications in systems. But that's broadly how I'd say that they're not arbitrary, because just any old classification system that you picked up would often not be useful for any purposes, either for conceptual clarification or for any practical purpose. But at the same time, the ones we use are informed by our interests. They're not purely given by the joints of nature. And that was my argument, because I don't think that nature has those sorts of joints. So that's just clarifying what my position was on that.
Just before I go to a question for James, can everybody hear both of our speakers? If not, I'll move them across the microphone, because I have no use for this microphone. So everyone can hear? Great, wonderful. All right. Well, I've just got a question for James now, and it's actually about so you bringing up naturalism and determinism, but you also mentioned stuff like quantum mechanics, quantum states. Does naturalism sit comfortably with non-deterministic phenomena such as quantum interactions might be a probabilistic thing, or stochastic processes?
Yeah, that's right. So I did talk about naturalist state systems being deterministic and non-naturalistic ones not being. I'm sort of not speaking very precisely there, but such is the nature of things. What I mean by that is that what I mean by that is that even quantum systems behave according to actually very precisely quantifiable and sort of describable behaviors. They follow rules and laws. There's an element, depending on your interpretation of quantum physics, which I don't want to go into tonight, there may or may not be an element of randomness to that. But my point is that there's still a sense in which quantum systems behave in law-like ways, and I guess that's what I'm getting at. Non-natural entities, it seems to me, at least the common idea of them, is that they don't behave in law-like ways. That particularly God, for example, could do whatever he or she wanted, and there's no law-like or regular way that we could describe their behavior. That's the idea that I'm getting at.
Sure. And do you have anything to mention there? I guess it's a bit outside of what you were positing, just in case.
I have some thoughts, but they're sort of
No, that's quite all right. Next question, I guess, and it's sort of about God necessarily being supernatural. My question is, if we had ontological evidence of a God, would that make it part of nature, therefore negating a supernatural claim, or is the evidence natural but the cause mysterious? Leon, would you like to sort of cash out?
Not sure. I mean, I think what you say is natural or not, again, this sort of comes back to a joints thing. For a naturalist, nature just refers to absolutely everything that exists in any sense whatsoever. So, for me, if you adopt that as your definition, then God is natural, because God exists. But
sorry to talk about I don't agree with that, because the way I described what I was saying is that I gave loose characterizations of what I mean by natural and non-natural entities, not a definition, but basic characterizations and examples. And by that, God would not have been a natural entity. And I also, I think it's possible that God or other non-natural entities could exist. I'm just saying I don't think that they do. Okay. So if they existed, I wouldn't say that by definition they're natural.
Okay, I take that point and agree with you entirely. So, if you, I think I just mean that the word natural has it has lots of different connotations, but you're right on my view, there is something, namely God, that is radically different from any, material thing.
Sure. Actually, I can go to your question now.
Yeah. Just the previous comment about God not being predictable and not having any explanatory power. That was one of your points, right? One of your arguments is that God has no explanatory power because he's unpredictable. That was one of your main arguments for why naturalism is a superior worldview to what would be Buddhism, I suppose. But I think in many theistic worldviews, God is predictable. So certainly in Christian worldview, he cannot act against his own character, so he is predictable, and that doesn't provide explanatory power to things. So what do you say to that?
So I'm not sure if that's a question so much as a rebuttal, but I think it's a legitimate point. Most worldviews, it's true, do say that their conception of gods or God or however they characterize them have certain regularities, you might say. Now that's what I would describe as a theology, right? It's a description of how God or beings like that are supposed to behave. My issue with that is that, I had two issues with that. One is that theologies like that seem to be outside of the sorts of things that I can adjudicate using philosophical reasoning and evidence from science. I don't really know how to adjudicate whether a theology is true unless it has particular implications for these sorts of discussions. So if someone says God is likely to, if someone says God is one and someone says God is a trinity, I don't know how to adjudicate that. It doesn't seem to me to be amenable to these sort of analyses. So I can see people might disagree with that, but to me it seems that a lot of those theological questions are just outside of things that I can adjudicate. using the tools that I know how to use, or at least that we're using in this debate. The second point is that it still seems to me that the precise problem with God is that he can do anything. And so anything that you say he actually does, it seems to have to reduce down to positing an additional reason or purpose. I suppose you can say a given class of actions that he takes may have a single reason in common, but still, whatever, say, intervention or miraculous exercise of power, whatever it is, however it is that God interacts with the world, it seems that he would need a reason or a purpose or some motivation to do that. And then, so for each of those, we would need to posit something new. Note that this isn't the case for human beings, because we have a very rich theory about human beings, biologically, sociologically, psychologically. We can say a lot by analogy about, well, I'm a human being and I know that when I'm hungry I want to eat food and so on. We can talk, we have so much knowledge about how humans behave that we can make a lot of inferences and infer behaviours and motivations to other people without a lot of worry. Sometimes we get into issues with that, but a lot of the time it works. And I'm saying none of that works in the case of God. And well, Leon may agree to some degree here because he rejects theistic personalism. But the point is that God is not a person. God is dramatically other. And if therefore God wants to do this or that, we don't seek out the knowledge about what God would be liable to do without postulating particular things that he would be likely to do this particular thing or that particular thing. That's what I'm saying, that we just don't seem to have that information about God. And I think it's difficult to see where all of that comes from without postulating lots of new things. Again, like the example I gave, if you want to say God created the universe in the way it is, well, why did he make the mass of the electron such and such? Or why did he make so much entropy? Or, you can go through all of the questions, and it seems you need to postulate a new reason for each one. Maybe not, but that's the issue I have with those type of explanations. They don't seem to do any explaining. Yeah, that's the idea.
And in terms of sort of your theology, Leon, did you have anything to comment about perhaps how you've elected that theology, where it's come from, in terms of just to make it very clear in the audience's mind the difference between James's sort of skepticism when it comes to how you can derive any sort of A, explanatory power from that, and B, how you actually get there in the first place, how you come up with your theology. So perhaps how did you arrive to the theology that you presented?
Okay, yeah, so I have a couple of comments. The first is to do with explanation. I think there's something going on here which I haven't sort of fully understood or got my head around. But James is sort of asking, what does, why did God pick the mass of the electron to be blah, and so on. But in some sense, I think most of the theistic arguments actually, they posit God because it seems like there's so many, it seems like there's just a massive amount of arbitrariness in the reductionist physicalist view of the universe. There are a lot of things that could be other than they are. So, I kind of think of God as like a form of reductionism, but just like on a different dimension. But as for theology, I think I disagree with what James is saying, that it's sort of completely open, because based on the way things are, I think people can and do make arguments about the nature of God. So for example, one of the books that I showed by an author who argues that God exists but is clearly not religious, they argue that because of the suffering in the world, we can argue that God doesn't care about humans. Or maybe because of the vast scale of the universe, we can argue that God doesn't care about humans. You could also argue that because the universe is the kind of universe that humans have come about in, we have these sort of amazing rational powers that seems nothing else in the universe has, that maybe God is specially interested in humans in some way. So I think you can actually make arguments about God's motivations and reasons for things based on stuff.
Sorry, can I? Yeah, go on. This actually seems to be an important question, and I think from that example, it seems to illustrate my concern, which is that people do attempt to use properties of the universe to infer aspects of God, or motivations, or whatever else about what God would want to do. But it seems to me that our data dramatically underdetermines that. So precisely that example, when people point to the good in the world and say, well, God cares about humans, or however else they phrase that. But other people do the exact opposite, point to the evil and say, well, God obviously doesn't care. And some other people say, well, because God is so dramatically other, we don't know all of his reasons, then maybe he has reasons that we don't understand for allowing evil to exist. It seems to me that these sorts of arguments are always going to be in place, that because God is all-powerful, and because he is so dramatically other to us, we're just never going to be in a position to put these theories and to have any degree of confidence as to what they are. And no, I'm not saying that God can't exist because of these analyses, or he can't have a reason. It doesn't strike me that we're ever going to be able to construct an explanatory theory which allows us to make sense of why things are the way they are in terms of God being liable to do this or that. Precisely because he could do anything and he's so different to us. That's the way it seems to me. I guess to some degree that's open to interpretation, but that's my concern.
Sorry, there's a question.
Sorry.
Well, actually, I should leave that to the bottom.
No, that's fine.
Question in the audience.
It's not going to be out of job. I'll actually take this question first, and then I'll jump to who had the question. Wonderful. Okay, and so you'll be next. But just because this is topical, just a springboard of talking about our ability for reason, given, say, for you, Leon, another realm by which you sort of perform a sort of reductionism, because that's ordered, right? In the unordered realm, perhaps that James is looking at an arbitrary realm that doesn't have these forms existent. The question says, how does a naturalist defend man's ability to reason? This is actually a frequent question. This is quite a common question, I think. And so I thought it would be interesting to bring up in a naturalistic worldview, and your mind is explained by fundamental particles. Is there any reason to believe that it bears any relation to truth in sort of global skepticism? What are your thoughts?
You want me?
Oh, sorry, yes, you
yes.
Yeah.
Well, I imagine Leon has something to say as well. So, so really, to answer that question properly, you need a theory of truth, and there are a lot of those, and I don't want to have to defend a particular one at the moment. I guess I would say that when we talk about truth, it seems to me most of the time we're saying that the structures or regularities that we describe in our language correspond in meaningful ways to those that pertain in nature. So mostly, and I say that because mostly we're not talking about fundamental particles, right? We're talking about whether we have true beliefs about things. Mostly we're talking about what I would describe as macro states, what Leon would talk about as forms, structures in nature. So truth, in my understanding, is something along the lines of a correspondence between our mental models, our concepts, and the way that those structure and order patterns are in the way the world is. So yeah, truth exists when there's a degree of correspondence between those, and obviously that's going to be in degrees, whether our concepts only sort of roughly correspond to how things are, or very closely. In terms of how we can account for that naturalistically, well, I'm not exactly sure what the question's getting at there, but I mean, we have minds. I think we can explain, not specifically, but in general terms, how minds are part of the natural world, and we then use those to think about those structures in the natural world. So again, we can ask, do our thoughts have that correspondence between the structure of the thought and the structure that exists out there, that exists in the patterns of those fundamental particles and how they're arranged? And that's all pretty vague, but at this level of abstraction, I think it has to be. And we can talk about our beliefs being true if that correspondence exists. And because we are embodied creatures that interact with the world around us through sensory organs and through motor control, things like that, there's a feedback mechanism. It's not just like we're completely extracted from the world. We are part of the world, and that's how, through that interactive process, we're able to gather knowledge about the way the world is. And that doesn't mean it's easy, and a lot of times we go wrong. And I think we should be cautious about trusting our intuitions and naive sort of perceptions about a lot of things. But in broad sense, I think that we can go about getting knowledge in that way. But I'm sure Leon has some thoughts on this.
Yes.
Can I also start that? Would it be worth, so this is somewhat of a dramatic suggestion, but just at some point having like discussion, crowd, audience discussion.
I'll just
Yeah, I just posit that as I didn't think about this when we were sort of planning the time.
When we planned it,
Just
just
seems like
before.
50 minutes.
No, I definitely think whoever wants to stay around past 8 o'clock, we'll mention that later, but I think we'll take from about 5 or 10 minutes too late, just a general discussion time for audience members. Because I mean, this is all good and to discuss at this level between two people for your benefit, but it makes a lot more sense to follow that up with actual interpersonal dialogue, because then we ground these concepts in how you cash that out in your lived experience, in your lives, in your theologies, or in your So I think that's I think that's what we'll do in about say 15 minutes or so. But yes, you're going to comment on James's response.
All I would say is that, no, sort of, I think this is sort of a bit further afield from me. Look, maybe all I would say is I think that a lot of what humans do with thinking and reasoning and so on is physical. I think I'm sympathetic to the idea that there's some sort of immaterial aspect to it. Not necessarily sort of a ghostly soul or anything like that. But yeah, I think that the way that humans can think somehow puts us in touch with its sort of God and the infinite in a way that is not the same as what animals do, for example.
Right. Now we had a question. Yes, what was your question?
Yeah, this is quite pertinent since you've started talking about consciousness of human beings. And this is a question for James's form of naturalism. Because your form of naturalism that reduces everything to the constituent particles as described in physics, maybe future physics. And that is that it appears that what is not appearing are as fundamental particles or in physics is conscious events, mental events, and that it needs to appear somewhere in a naturalist ontology. And let me give you an example. We can ask the question of why did Henry VIII have Anne Boleyn's head chopped off? And in principle, we could give a complete physical explanation in terms of the microparticles, atoms, quarks, for why the blade fell on Anne Boleyn's neck. But even if we knew all of that and somebody gave an answer in terms of physics, that's not answering my question or anyone's question of why did Henry VIII order Anne Boleyn's execution. So in terms of reasons and mental human desires and drives, there's something missing from a naturalist reductionist account that is just having in the microparticles in physics. We still have to bring in conscious events and mental events. I think that's going to come in maybe another 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We're not there yet. But it's something we need to have a placeholder in there in our current naturalist view.
So this question, just to sum that up,
Oh,
because
well,
I think
the question is, what does James think about how we ought to or do we need to fit in mental events, at least as a placeholder, in a naturalist view today?
And would that be more of, say, akin to Leon's forms concept? Or
Oh, definitely not.
No, it's not.
No.
So could you clarify, just for me as well?
No.
Your placeholder is in a naturalistic framework.
Definitely, and it would be a nominalist.
Yeah.
A nominalist.
So the question
So nominalism would be a part of that.
So it's sort of a twofold question. It doesn't seem to be enough space in naturalist language to account for the motivation as to why Henry would order such a thing. And our placeholder will probably be naturalist. James, what would that look
Well,
like?
there are non-reductive forms of naturalism, which maybe what is being gestured at here, but I think this comes back to something Leon talked about before when he talked about the information and intentionality, particularly about how we fit that into a naturalistic framework. So in answer to that question, I want to emphasize that I'm not claiming that everything that exists is reduced to fundamental particles. That is, that somehow that means that everything is just the fundamental particles. My point is that all of the higher order properties that we talk about are true, or they pertain in virtue of the arrangements of fundamental particles, but it's the arrangements of them and their interactions that is the key there. As Leon said, that's where nearly all the work is. The point about the fundamental particles is just to understand what sort of lies at the base of that. But the arrangements and interactions is all the interesting stuff. Now, to say that if we were to fully explain all of the fundamental particles that make up someone's brain and body and so on, and fully articulate all of the high water properties that result from those, that there would be something left over, that say consciousness or intentionality would be left out of that. That's begging the question, essentially, because my argument is that there wouldn't be anything left out, that would constitute a complete description of the system, that there's no causal powers or other properties there that would not be accounted for by the lower order ones. Leon, of course, disagrees. So my argument is that, say, intentionality, consciousness, mental states, people having reasons for things, these are all macro states that supervene or sit on top of. They supervene on the patterns of electrical activity in our brains, which then supervene on the cellular structures there, which supervene on the molecular architecture and so on. And you go down the hierarchy, right? There's no need to go all the way down there for most purposes. We can just talk at the higher level for most purposes. And so this is why I was talking about before about eliminativism. So I'm not an eliminativist. I'm not saying we should do away with all the higher order talk. This is what some people say. We should stop talking about intentional states or stop talking about biological concepts because they're all nonsense and we should get rid of them. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we should understand them as existing in virtue of the interaction of fundamental particles. But by all means, keep using them and keep talking about them in so much as they're useful for us. So in terms of intentionality, it's a macro state. It's a very complex arrangement and interaction of fundamental particles. Exactly how does that work? Well, I don't know, because science is in the business of working that out. I'm making a metaphysical claim that that's all there is to it. And my basis for that claim is it doesn't seem like we need to posit anything else in principle.
Yeah, so I think this is a good point at which to get to a point of clarification, because it could be the case that in some sense reductionism is true, on my view, in some sense reductionism is true. There is sort of a level of fundamental particles, in virtue of which everything else sort of holds. But I suppose my position would then be that there still remains something to explain, namely, form and the way the universe happens to be. There's still something else to explain.
Yes, and fundamentally what I'm saying is that if you have the lower order stuff and somehow were to extrapolate all of the properties of that, then there wouldn't be anything left to explain. And I'm just emphasising that as an important difference between what we think.
And just before I go back to you, sir, there's another question, just because this is great for where you've ended up here in train of thought. Going back to the floppy disk metaphor that Dawkins had. Yeah. Now, you said there was just to clarify, did you say that there was an issue with the floppy disk metaphor in the sense that it was hylomorphist? Or was there no issue and it was sort of, there was no issue in the sense that Dawkins shouldn't have put it that way because it gives away a latent hylomorphism on his part,
Okay, so it was a bit confusing. I was arguing in favour of hylomorphism. I was exhibiting that Richard Dawkins quote as an example of very strong hylomorphism, particularly when he said there's no metaphor here. It's actually just exactly how it is. It's literally software, outside your window. And I was exhibiting someone who holds a more reductionist view, saying, Richard Dawkins, please stop speaking like that. It's not true. Stop using this language. Come on, it's sort of not respectable. We should get rid of this language from biology.
Yeah, right. So
I'm in favour of Richard Dawkins.
Well, so as an atheist, I naturally have to take the case against Richard Dawkins. Essentially, because I'm saying, my view is similar to, was it John Wilkins? You quote? Yeah.
Maybe it's actually around here.
I've mentioned it before, but a cool guy. But I essentially agree with him, except I'm not an eliminativist, so I'm not saying that Dawkins shouldn't use that language of information, but he shouldn't say that it's literally true in the reigning floppy disk sense. I think that's overstepping the mark. It's a conceptual apparatus that we use to understand how biology behaves. And I think it's perfectly useful in terms of describing those macro states. But saying that it's literally true, I think, is a bit far. And that's really just a whole position that Dawkins is not being very careful philosophically there, and that's nothing new in my opinion.
So given that, so given that clarification, the question is it measurable? The information of the floppy disk, the algorithms, without having to evoke a sort of ethereal forms concept. So for example, yes, it is. It can be thought of as to be information raining down the form of DNA or whatever. But isn't it also right to say that this DNA isn't disembodied ethereal information? So it's not just the form or the pattern. It is, as James put it with the dot matrix printer, an actual measurable code, say for example a floppy disk, your magnetic pattern is measurable by physics, but we identifying the pattern call it code. Right? Where is the necessity to place the forms concept over this, or is there not in this case?
Yeah, so well, I'm not sure exactly what the question was, but for example, we can measure, in some sense, the information in DNA. Like, if you just assume this is not true, but that every DNA base is sort of equally and fully informative, then there's about as much information in every cell in your body as there is on DNA, more or less, and that's sort of enough to reconstruct you. So we can use a whole bunch of the same mathematics, a whole bunch of the same sort of scientific ideas to talk about floppy disks and to talk about DNA and organisms and so on. And I suppose what I'm also arguing is that the language of purposes and things programmed for a particular reason and so on can also be applied fairly straightforwardly to DNA and to organisms.
Right.
And in fact, yeah, and this sort of language, we're not arguing about this, but it is absolutely pervasive in actual biology. Like, people talk about, the function of genes, we're trying to find out the function of X, Y, and Z. Yeah, I can see Richard is a colleague nodding.
The question from my mind, though, is does that sort of language have ontological implications? That is, does that mean that there are forms or something that we have to put into our set of things that exist that correspond to this sort of language? To me, it doesn't. To me, it's a useful way of describing those higher order patterns. And I guess that's a fundamental point of dispute, whether we should make ontological inferences on the basis of these sorts of descriptions.
So, on to your question, I believe it was
Yeah. I think it's kind of working with your question as well about how does the naturalist worldview, how will it come to explain consciousness and that type of thing, I think. And I think it's got to do with one of the first things you said at the beginning. You said that you're not making a semantic or epistemological argument. So how do you fit epistemology and semantics into the naturalist worldview?
How do I fit the...
How do you fit, I suppose, similar question to the gentleman here, what he asked, like how do you fit the question of, like, why, for instance, why Anne Boleyn was executed into the naturalist worldview? How do you fit those other questions that I think theology might answer into your worldview? How does naturalism answer that?
Well, I must not have done... I feel like that this is pretty much the exact same question, and that I probably didn't do a very good job of answering it in the first place. Let me try and say very briefly. So, intentionality, for example, and reasons for executing someone or whatever else, these are psychological properties, I would say. So they're very abstract states of affairs that exist in the world. Now, I say that psychological phenomena like that supervene, they sit on top of, they are true in virtue of underlying neurological substrates, essentially our brains and our nervous systems. And then you can, that leads you into the reduction hierarchy. You can keep going down then as long as you want, from brains down to fundamental particles. But my point is we shouldn't fixate on the fundamental particles. That's part of my theory, but that's not really where the interesting stuff is. The interesting stuff is all about how do those psychological states exist in, how are they produced by the underlying neurological substrate? And that's the open questions in neuroscience and psychology, right? Where I'm trying to progress in those fields. Really, the only core point that I'm saying is that the causal powers of neurons and the neural substrates and so on is sufficient to give rise to mental phenomena, and we don't need any other substances, any forms or immaterial souls or anything like that. We don't need to put anything else in our ontology to account for these the phenomena, the mental phenomena. That's all my claim is. And again, my justification for that claim is that it doesn't seem that we need to. It doesn't seem that they add anything.
Okay, I've got one more question here before we run out of time, but I can probably squeeze in one more from the audience. I think I saw your hand, so yes. So.
James, I was just wondering, in your ontology, is there room for the concept of choice? true sense, or is the world
So this is about determinism pretty much.
Yeah.
Well, free will, I guess that had to come up. Always comes up. Look, it's always going to be dependent on what your concept of free will is. So in the literature, there's a concept of libertarian free will, which, well, that's very hard to define. I guess I would just say I don't believe in libertarian free will, which is perhaps the naive sense of free will, where there's sort of some disembodied self which makes choices that are not at all causally determined or constrained by anything in the natural world, and that the choices just sort of come from us, and that we make them totally free. That's a very hand-waved explanation. It's very hard to pin down exactly what the idea is. Now, if that's what's meant by free will, and I don't believe it exists, because I don't believe that has no place in the reductionistic naturalistic framework that I've given, when everything is explicable in terms of the interaction of fundamental particles. There's no libertarian choice element there. So I don't believe in that sort of free will, but it doesn't follow from that I don't believe in free will simpliciter, because I have a different conception of what free will is. I think of free will as, again, one of these macro states, a supervenient concept. It refers to, so we make a choice freely when we make it under a certain set of essentially psychological, maybe social circumstances, when we're relevantly informed about the relevant decisions, when we're not coerced, and you could give a long list of different higher order properties that would characterize a free decision. And so when a cognitive agent acts or makes a decision, given those set of criteria, in my view, then they are said to act freely, despite the fact that the choice that they make is obviously going to be determined by the underlying natural causes. To me, that they're not in conflict, because I don't understand free will in a libertarian sense. I understand it in what's called a compatibilist sense.
So free will then in that context is a set of conditions which hypothetically could enable someone to choose, but drawing a line from the microparticles to the quote-unquote choice, there is no ability to choose in the true sense, because...
Well, see, that's prejudicing the concept, right? So if you want to say that libertarian free will is the true and only real form of free will, then according to that, my view is not real free will, but I just reject that characterization. The view is called compatibilism. It says that determinism, a choice being causally determined by antecedent conditions, is consistent with that choice being freely made. And I hold that view because I think that the concept of free choice supervenes on natural states of affairs, which themselves could be causally determined. So the relevant sense in which a choice is free is, again, if it meets those criteria, if it's not coerced, and if we have relevant information, if the person's of sound mind, blah, 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 we meet all these criteria. Now, underpinning those could be, or will be, causally determined natural states of affairs. But I don't see those as in conflict with the choice being free, because they're talking about different things. Now, I understand that some people see free will as, they don't see it that way, they see it as a different thing. And of course, then we're just going to be arguing about, well, what's the true free will? I guess all I can really say is that here is my conception of free will, and it is consistent with the reductive naturalistic framework that I've given. There are alternative conceptions of free will that are not consistent with that framework.
And generally, colloquially, when we refer to free will, this is what you're saying, that that's libertarianism.
Well, look, I don't really know what people have in their mind when colloquially they talk about free will. It might be something like that for some people, but I think the concept is not well formed in most cases, so it's hard to say.
But you also don't think the self has any ontological status ultimately either.
Can I actually just respond to the initial question in a way that will probably mean not respond to the text? So, but yeah, so I saw a philosopher called Daniel Dennett give a talk on pretty much this topic, but the way I understood the talk was in a sort of hylomorphist way, so maybe the helpful can be a helpful thing. But he argued that free will, so he's also a compatibilist, but he was arguing that free will, whether or not we have free will, has nothing to do with determinism or indeterminism. And the example he gave was, he said that free will is basically like the strength of a chess playing algorithm. Okay, so you can imagine two chess playing algorithms, and let's say they're deterministic algorithms, but one will always beat the other. We can say, okay, that one's better. But now imagine if the algorithms have like random inputs, like maybe they're based on something called Monte Carlo tree search studies. They're just sort of looking at different possible future moves. Imagine they have, so imagine the two algorithms have completely random inputs. It still makes sense to say that one algorithm is better than the other. So what he was arguing is that, likewise, free will depends on what I would say, depends on the algorithm. Doesn't actually depend exactly on on the exact nature of the substrate, for example, whether or not it's deterministic or not. There could be multiple possible substrates, and it would still be the case that one algorithm was better than the other. So I think of free will similarly, but I think that is sort of a hylomorphist claim. It's like there is this structure, it doesn't actually depend on exactly what the substrate is. That determines whether or not, your will is sort of free or coerced or whatever. So, I mean, Daniel does not believe in this, but he does believe in something called, quote, real patterns, unquote. Which I would say seems like realism about universals to me. I'm not making fun of him at all either, I'm just saying he doesn't think of it in this way. But that was how I understood the talk.
Right. Well, we probably don't have enough time for any more questions if we're going to leave that small amount of time just to have a discussion amongst ourselves. And also, we would like to continue this discussion even for 15 minutes or so. If there's enough interest, we might go down to the Clyde Hotel or pretty much anywhere that we can get a seat and continue. Actually, like sort of cashing this out with people sitting next to you or whoever, some of the things that you've been processing. So if that's something that you'd like to do, I invite you along to that. Probably won't go for too long, Leon has to get going, that sort of thing, but we might have a bite to eat and discuss. But apart from that, I'm going to give both of our speakers just another minute just to say any final remarks, and then we'll conclude. So perhaps starting with you, James, since you began, any final remarks?
So I just wanted to thank everyone very much for coming this evening. Leon and I have been talking about doing something like this for a long time, and it's a real pleasure to finally get it to happen. Hopefully you found the talks and the subjects of interest. I know some of it was sort of high level. Hopefully you sort of got at it what you could. I don't anticipate that everything we say will be of interest to everyone, but the idea here is that Leon and I have different worldviews, right? We have different ways of looking at the world and making sense of it. I've tried to explain to you a part of my worldview, reductive naturalism. And when I say it's my worldview, it's the one I'm leaning towards. It's the one that seems to fit the best to me. I'm not saying that I'm dogmatically attached to it and it's definitely true or anything like that. But I've given some reasons as to why I think it's reasonable to hold. And what I invite everyone here to do is to think about these questions. Whether hylomorphism or reductionism is true might seem a bit academic to you, but these questions actually do matter because they inform our decisions about ethics and about religion and about even political causes. Our views about abstract things can have important implications for our views about quite concrete things, and that's why these questions are of interest to me. So we didn't cash out a lot of those tonight, we just mostly focused on the higher order level, but I think that they do have important applications, and it is worth thinking about these things. So that's what I'd end on as an injunction to continue thinking about this. Please come up and talk to me afterwards if you have further questions or want to tell me why I'm wrong, or you can contact me online. I think pretty much everyone here would have the ability to do that. So please do, and thanks again for coming in.
And Leo, any final remarks from you?
Just ditto everything James said, but I'd also add that I think in some respects there is actually quite a big common. Both of our views are about what sort of grounds what, and what's the fundamental kind of thing or things that we should posit in the way that the world is organised. Just point out that substantive commonality despite all the differences.
Yeah, that's an important point because in debates you naturally emphasise the disagreement, but there is quite a lot of commonality between our positions, and I think that's important to realise as well. Commonality and difference.
You can join with me thanking both of our speakers for tonight. Some excellent and I hope thought-provoking thoughts were raised tonight. And again, as I said before at the beginning of this whole thing, if you have a stone in your shoe, that's a very good thing. Should never shy away from something that sort of doesn't quite fit right because it can promote new understanding. And not just new understanding for yourself, but new understanding in the way that you see another person is very powerful. I'd like to also thank Victor Fodor for doing the photography and filming tonight. If you can join with me in thanking Victor. Apart from that, please chat amongst yourselves, come up to both of our speakers with any ongoing questions.